My parents kicked me out and said, "Figure it out, Darky." But after my aunt told them just 4 words, they were begging me to come back. On the morning of my 18th birthday, I woke up to my parents shoving all my belongings into bin bags. "Your sister Eve needs her own room. It's time for you to move out." The thing is, Eve already had her own room, but she was a light-skinned girl who actually looked mixed race. Meanwhile, I was dark-skinned, taking after my mom's side. And that's all that ever mattered to them. But where am I supposed to go? Mom didn't even look at me. "Figure it out, Darky." In the doorway, I saw Eve staring with tears in her eyes. We were always close despite how differently they treated us. She'd sneak me food when they forgot to set my place at dinner, which happened at least twice a week. But now, while our parents continued packing my life away, Eve wouldn't make eye contact. But as soon as they went downstairs to get more bags, she pressed something into my hand. A crumpled piece of paper with our aunt's phone number. "Call her. They said they'd kick me out too if I helped you." "I'm sorry." My hands were shaking as I stood on the sidewalk with 3 garbage bags of belongings. The door had already slammed behind me. I stared at that phone number for probably 10 minutes before finally calling. "Hello?" The voice was warm, nothing like Mom's. "Aunt Yolanda? This is your niece." Mom just kicked me out. There was silence. Then, "I'll text you my address. Come now." I'd never even known Mom had a sister. The moment she saw the garbage bags, her face changed. "What the heck? You don't know what just happened, do you?" I asked, voice shaking. She pulled me inside, and I just broke. Everything poured out at once. The years of racist comments, being called Darky, watching Eve get everything while I got leftovers, literally having food withheld as punishment when the skin bleaching cream didn't work. "Eve tried to help," I sobbed. "She gave me your number. They threatened to kick her out too if she helped me." Aunt Yolanda had been holding me, but when I said that, her entire body went rigid. "They threatened both my girls?" The way she said both made my chest tight, like Eve and I both belonged to her somehow. "How long have they been treating you like this?" "Since I was maybe 12? When I started getting darker and Eve stayed light." She opened her laptop with a snap that made me jump. The look on her face was something between rage and satisfaction, like someone who'd been waiting years to play their hand. "They're going to regret this," she said quietly. "They're going to beg you to come back." "How? They don't care about me." "Oh, sweetheart." She touched my face gently. "Your parents are about to learn something about themselves they never knew. Something I've kept hidden for 15 years. Before I could ask what she meant, she picked up her phone and called my mom. "Sister," she said into the phone, voice perfectly pleasant. "Family dinner tomorrow at my house. We need to discuss OP's situation." I could hear Mom through the phone. "Good. Maybe you can talk sense into her about getting a job instead of being a freeloader." The next evening, my parents arrived looking smug. Dad was actually whistling. They genuinely thought Aunt Yolanda had called them to say I was too difficult, that she was going to make me homeless. Eve was with them, looking pale and confused. She kept glancing at me, and I tried to give her a reassuring look. We were halfway through the main course when Yolanda set down her fork. "I've been meaning to discuss your finances." Mom actually laughed. "We're doing great, thanks. Richard just got another bonus." "Interesting." Aunt Yolanda pulled out her iPad, swiping casually. "Because your mortgage payment just bounced." Dad's fork clattered. "That's impossible. Must be a bank error." "No error." She took a sip of wine. "I stopped paying it, like I've been doing for 15 years. "What are you talking about?" Mom's voice was high-pitched. Aunt Yolanda started listing everything, still eating her dinner like she was discussing the weather. "Your salary, Richard? That bonus you just mentioned? Doesn't exist. Eve's school tuition was paid by me. The cars in your driveway? My leases. Your medical insurance? Mom's prescriptions? The country club you love so much? All paid for by me." With each revelation, she pulled up the receipts on her iPad, sliding it across the table. "You're lying." Mom's face had gone white. "You're making this up." "Am I?" Aunt Yolanda picked up her phone. "Let me call Richard's boss." She put it on speaker. A man answered on the second ring. "Hi, Tom. It's Yolanda Taylor. Can you confirm Richard's employment status?" "He's never worked here, Ms. Taylor. As you know, you pay us to maintain that fiction." Eve made a sound like she'd been punched. We both did. Mom stood up. "You don't have a job?" she yelled at Dad. "Then where have you been going every day?" His knees were buckling. "We can talk about that later." "No!" Mom was furious now. "Are you still meeting up with Jasmine?" Dad went even paler as soon as her name was mentioned. Eve suddenly chimed in. "What does she mean, Dad? Is she talking about my 18-year-old best friend Jasmine? The one who's pregnant?" I looked back at Aunt Yolanda, who was getting ready to do something none of us saw coming. Aunt's fingers were already moving across her phone screen before anyone could process what was happening next. She didn't look up from the device as she spoke, her voice calm but carrying this edge that made my stomach drop even further. Mom was breathing so hard I could hear it from across the table, these sharp little gasps, and Eve had her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. I grabbed the edge of my chair so tight my knuckles hurt, because I knew whatever Aunt was about to say would make everything worse somehow. She finally looked up from her phone and locked eyes with Dad, not blinking, not moving, just staring at him like she could see right through every lie he'd ever told. Dad started to stand up, but Aunt held up one hand and he froze halfway out of his chair, then slowly sank back down. The air felt thick and heavy, like right before a storm hits and nobody was eating anymore. All the food just sitting there getting cold while we waited. Aunt set her phone down on the table with this soft click that somehow sounded loud in the silence. She kept her eyes on Dad the whole time as she started talking about Jasmine, saying the name slowly and clearly like she wanted to make sure everyone heard it. Anita Cardenas had called her 2 days ago, Aunt explained, after Jasmine finally broke down and told her mom everything about the affair and the pregnancy. Dad's face went from pale to gray, this sick color that made him look 10 years older in seconds. Aunt pulled up something on her iPad and started swiping through what looked like receipts and calendar entries, her voice still calm as she listed dates and times. She had a timeline of every meeting between Dad and Jasmine going back 6 months, including receipts from the hotel on Riverside Drive that he'd claimed was for business travel, when really he was meeting a teenager. Eve made this sound like she was choking, and Mom's head snapped toward Dad, so fast I thought she might hurt her neck. Mom was out of her chair before I even registered she was moving, lunging across the table at Dad with her hands reaching for his face. Plates crashed and glasses tipped over, wine spreading across the white tablecloth in dark red stains. Eve jumped up and grabbed Mom's arm, trying to pull her back while Mom was screaming words I'd never heard her say before, calling Dad things that made me flinch. Dad had pushed his chair back so hard it fell over, scrambling away from Mom's reaching hands. Aunt stood up and her voice cut through all the noise, sharp and commanding in a way I'd never heard from her before. She told everyone to sit down right now or leave her house immediately, and something about the tone made everyone stop moving. Mom was still standing there with Eve holding her arm, breathing hard and staring at Dad with this look of pure hate on her face. Aunt repeated herself, slower this time, saying either everyone sits down and acts like adults, or the dinner is over and they can leave. Eve gently pulled Mom back to her chair, and Mom sat down hard, her whole body shaking. Dad picked up his fallen chair and sat back down too, his hands trembling so bad he had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming, thick and heavy with all this rage and shock that nobody knew what to do with. Aunt calmly picked up the fallen glasses and soaked up the wine with her napkin like nothing had happened, then sat back down and looked at Dad again. Dad opened his mouth and started talking fast, words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain. He said Jasmine had pursued him, that she was mature for her age, that she understood him in ways Mom never did. His voice got higher and more desperate as he went on, saying he never meant for it to happen, but Jasmine made it clear she was interested. Aunt let him talk for maybe 30 seconds before she cut him off, her voice cold and flat. She stated the facts slowly, like she was explaining something to a child. Jasmine is Eve's best friend. Jasmine is barely 18 years old. Dad is 45 years old. He knew exactly what he was doing when he started this affair. Aunt picked up her phone and slid it across the table to Dad, the screen showing a text thread. She told him to read it out loud, but he just stared at the screen, his face going even more gray. Aunt reached over and started reading the messages herself. Dad's text to Jasmine discussing when and where to meet, asking her to delete their messages, telling her to lie to her mom about where she was going. With each message Aunt read, Dad seemed to shrink smaller in his chair. Eve was staring at Dad with this look I'd never seen on her face before, like she was seeing a stranger instead of her father. Mom had gone completely still, not crying anymore, just sitting there with her hands flat on the table, and this blank expression that was somehow scarier than the screaming had been. Eve stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loud against the floor. Her voice was shaking but clear as she started talking, looking right at Dad. She told him she would never forgive him for this betrayal, that he'd destroyed something she could never get back. Jasmine came to their house for sleepovers, Eve said, her voice getting stronger. Jasmine trusted their family, thought of them as safe, as people who would protect her, and Dad took advantage of her being young and confused and dealing with her own difficult home life. Eve's hands were balled into fists at her sides as she kept going, saying that Jasmine had confided in her about feeling lost and alone, and Dad used that vulnerability to manipulate her into an affair. Mom reached out toward Eve, trying to take her hand, but Eve jerked away. She turned to Mom and said that Mom had enabled this whole thing by never once questioning where Dad really went all day, by accepting his lies about work without ever checking. Mom tried to argue, but Eve talked over her, saying that Mom was so focused on skin color and appearances that she never noticed her own husband was a predator. The word hung in the air like a physical thing, and Dad flinched like he'd been hit. Eve stood there breathing hard, tears running down her face, but her voice steady, and I felt this surge of pride for my sister, even through all the chaos. I sat there watching my family completely fall apart in real time, and it felt weird, like I was watching a movie instead of living through it. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion and too fast all at once. Mom was crying again. Dad looked like he might throw up. Eve was still standing with her fists clenched, and Aunt just sat there calm and collected like she'd planned this whole thing out, which I guess she had. Aunt stood up and announced that dinner was over, her voice leaving no room for argument. She told my parents they needed to leave immediately, right now, no discussion. Then she laid it out plain and simple. They had 24 hours to decide if they wanted to sign a formal agreement that included mandatory therapy, real accountability for their actions, and treating both their daughters with actual respect and equality. If they signed and followed through, she would continue the financial support. If they refused or broke any part of the agreement, all financial support would stop permanently and immediately. No second chances, No negotiations, no exceptions. Dad started to say something, but Aunt held up her hand and he shut his mouth. Mom was staring at Aunt with this mix of fear and anger, probably realizing for the first time that Aunt held all the power here, and there was nothing Mom could do about it. Mom turned to me, tears streaming down her face, and her voice came out all shaky and desperate. She said I was destroying this family by staying here with Aunt, that I was tearing everyone apart, that if I would just come home and stop being difficult, then everything could go back to normal. Something inside me snapped when she said that, like a rubber band that had been stretched too tight for too long. I found my voice for the first time all evening, and it came out stronger than I expected. I told her clearly, looking right at her, that they destroyed this family years ago when they started calling me slurs and withholding food and treating me like I was less than human because of my skin color. I said normal was never good for me. Normal meant being hungry and scared and hating myself. I told her I wasn't destroying anything. I was just refusing to be destroyed anymore. Aunt nodded at me with this proud look on her face and stood up, walking toward the front door. She told my parents to follow her, not asking, but telling. Dad and Mom got up slowly, Mom still crying, and Dad looking like he might collapse. Aunt opened a drawer in the hall table and pulled out a folder, thick with papers. She handed it to Dad and explained these were the formal terms of the agreement. Everything spelled out clearly with no room for confusion. They had until tomorrow evening at 6 to decide. Then she opened the front door and stood there waiting, making it clear they needed to leave now. After the door closed behind them, I heard Eve make this sound, something between a sob and a gasp. I looked over and she was sliding down the wall, her legs just giving out until she was sitting on the floor. She was sobbing about Jasmine, saying over and over that she should have seen the signs, that she brought Jasmine into this house, that it was her fault. I got up and went to her, sitting down on the floor right next to her. We just held each other while she cried, her whole body shaking against mine. Aunt gave us space, disappearing into the kitchen, and I could hear water running and the quiet sounds of her making tea. Eve kept saying she missed all the signs, that Jasmine had been acting weird for months and she just thought it was stress from the school. I pulled back enough to look at her face and told her firmly that Dad's choices were not her responsibility, that he was the adult who betrayed everyone's trust. She tried to argue, but I kept talking, saying that nothing she did or didn't do made Dad decide to have an affair with a teenager. He made that choice all on his own and he was the only one responsible for it. Eve's crying got quieter, but she still held on to me tight, like she was scared to let go. Aunt came back with 3 mugs of tea on a tray, the steam rising up in little wisps. She set it down on the coffee table and sat in the chair across from where Eve and I were still on the floor. She explained gently that she'd known about Dad's affair for 3 months now, her voice soft but clear. Eve's head came up fast, staring at Aunt with red eyes. Aunt kept talking, saying she'd hired a private investigator after she noticed some strange charges on the credit card she pays for. Hotel rooms on weekdays, restaurant bills for 2 when Dad was supposedly at work alone, gas purchases near Jasmine's neighborhood. The investigator had followed Dad and documented everything, taking photos and keeping detailed records of every meeting. Aunt said she'd been building documentation ever since, waiting for the right moment to use it. She explained that she waited to reveal it because she needed leverage that was strong enough to protect both Eve and me permanently, not just make a scene that would blow over. If she'd confronted Dad quietly, he would have denied everything, and my parents would have closed ranks against her. But now, with everything out in the open and proof that couldn't be denied, she had the power to force real change. Eve asked why Aunt had been paying for everything all these years, her voice small and confused. Aunt sat back in her chair and took a sip of her tea before answering. She started talking about our maternal grandmother, how she was extremely colorist, always favoring the lighter-skinned children and grandchildren. Aunt said she watched Mom absorb those toxic values growing up, saw how Grandma would praise Mom's lighter skin while criticizing Aunt's darker complexion. When Aunt built her successful consulting business and started making real money, Mom came to her asking for help. They made a deal, Aunt explained. Aunt would fund the lifestyle Mom wanted, the nice house and cars and country club membership, all of it. In exchange, Mom promised to treat all her children equally, to never let colorism poison her own family the way it had poisoned theirs. Aunt's voice got harder as she said that Mom broke that promise the moment I started getting darker, the moment it became clear I took after the darker skinned side of the family. She said she should have cut off the money right then, but she convinced herself that as long as she was providing financial support, at least I wouldn't be completely abandoned. She realized too late that money alone doesn't change hearts, that she should have intervened directly instead of hoping financial dependence would keep Mom in line. Aunt looked at me when she said that last part, her eyes sad, and told me she was sorry for not protecting me sooner. Something warm spread through my chest hearing her say that. Like all those years of wondering if I was crazy or too sensitive suddenly had an answer. Aunt kept talking, explaining that when she and Mom made their deal 15 years ago, it was supposed to protect me and any future kids from the colorism that destroyed their own childhood. She said she noticed things during holiday visits, the way Mom's voice got sharper when she talked to me compared to Eve, how my plate always had less food, the comments about my skin getting darker every summer. But she convinced herself that as long as she kept paying for everything, at least I wouldn't be completely abandoned or left without resources. Her voice got quieter when she said my 18th birthday changed everything, that seeing me on her doorstep with garbage bags full of my stuff made her realize money doesn't fix hate, it just funds it. She said she should have cut them off years ago and taken me in. but she kept hoping the financial pressure would make them change on its own. The way she looked at me when she said all this made me feel like maybe I actually mattered to someone, like my suffering wasn't just something to ignore or work around. Eve's voice cut through the heavy silence in the room. She asked if she could stay here tonight because she couldn't face going back to that house. Aunt didn't even hesitate before saying yes and telling Eve she could stay as long as she needed, that both of us had a home here now. I watched Eve's whole body relax like someone had cut strings that were holding her too tight. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Mom saying she was sleeping at Aunt's house, then showed us before hitting send. Her phone started ringing within seconds, Mom's name flashing on the screen over and over. Eve stared at it for a moment before pressing the power button and turning the whole thing off. The room went quiet again, except for the sound of Aunt collecting dishes from the table, moving around the kitchen like this was all completely normal. Like our entire family hadn't just exploded in her dining room an hour ago. That night, I lay in the guest bed staring at the white ceiling, my brain going too fast to even think about sleep. Everything that happened kept playing on repeat. Watching my parents walk in all smug and confident, then watching that confidence crack and shatter as Aunt pulled out receipt after receipt. The power shift felt unreal, like I'd been living in one version of the world where I was worthless, and suddenly got dropped into a different version where I had value and protection. I kept hearing Aunt say both my girls in my head, the way she claimed me and Eve together like we were a unit she'd been watching over this whole time. My parents went from calling me slurs and throwing my stuff in garbage bags to desperate and exposed in under 2 hours, and I didn't know how to process that kind of reversal. Part of me felt scared that it was temporary, that they'd find some way to flip things back. But another part felt something I hadn't felt in years, like maybe I actually belonged somewhere safe now, like maybe Aunt's house could be home in a way my parents' house never was. I woke up to something moving on the floor and realized Eve was sleeping in a sleeping bag next to my bed. She must have been too scared to sleep alone in the other guest room. The morning light coming through the curtains showed her face was puffy from crying, and when she heard me moving, she opened her eyes. We started talking quietly about what happens next, keeping our voices low even though we were the only ones awake. Eve admitted she was terrified of Mom's anger, that Mom's rage when she felt betrayed was something we both knew too well. But she said she was more terrified of going back to that house where Dad had been lying about everything for years, where we'd been living in some fake version of reality funded by Aunt while Dad pretended to have a job and messed around with her best friend. I told her she was brave for choosing to stay here, that it took guts to pick safety over trying to keep Mom happy. Eve started crying again, saying she should have protected me better all these years, that she knew what was happening, and she was too scared to do more than sneak me food sometimes. I reminded her that they threatened to kick her out too if she helped me, that she was also a victim of their manipulation, but I could tell she was going to carry that guilt for a while. Over breakfast, Aunt laid out the plan with surprising calm considering last night's chaos. She said she had a meeting scheduled this afternoon with her attorney, Virginia Shaw, to formalize everything into a compliance agreement. The terms would be specific, mandatory family therapy, written apology letters from both parents, zero colorist language ever again, and both me and Eve get to choose where we live without any pressure or guilt trips. She explained that if any term gets broken, even once, the financial support stops immediately and permanently. Aunt said she wasn't interested in half efforts or promises to try harder, that the agreement would be legally binding and enforceable. She'd already talked to Virginia last night after my parents left, and the attorney was drafting everything this morning. I asked what happens if they just refuse to sign, and Aunt said calmly that their mortgage payment already bounced, the car leases are in her name, and their medical insurance expires in 2 weeks. She said they'd figure out pretty quickly that refusing wasn't an option, not if they wanted to keep their house and their lifestyle. Eve asked what happens about Jasmine and the baby, her voice small and worried. Aunt explained that situation was separate, that Anita Cardenas was handling that part and had her own attorney. She said she'd talked to Anita this morning and they agreed to keep the issues separate so the focus could stay on protecting me and Eve. The Jasmine situation was about Dad's affair and the pregnancy, and that needed to be dealt with through Anita's attorney and probably the courts for child support and custody stuff. But the colorism and abuse toward me and the threats toward Eve, that was what Aunt's agreement would address. I felt grateful that Aunt was thinking strategically instead of letting everything blur together into more chaos. She was compartmentalizing the problems, so each one could be handled properly instead of becoming one giant mess where nothing got fixed. My phone started buzzing on the counter where I'd left it charging overnight. I picked it up and saw a flood of texts from Mom, maybe 20 or 30 messages that came in while I was asleep. The first few were begging me to come home, saying she was sorry, and we could work this out as a family. Then they shifted to blaming me for ruining everything, saying I was tearing the family apart by staying with Aunt and turning Eve against them. Aunt walked over and gently took my phone from my hands. She showed me how to set up a separate folder for Mom's messages, so I could check them when I was ready, but didn't have to see them constantly popping up on my screen. This small thing, just helping me control the contact, made me feel less powerless. Aunt said I didn't owe Mom immediate responses, that I could take all the time I needed to decide if and when I wanted to engage. She reminded me that Mom's feelings weren't my responsibility, especially after years of Mom not caring about my feelings at all. Dad texted Eve directly while we were still at breakfast, and Eve's phone lit up with his name. She read the message with her face getting paler, then showed it to me. Dad was trying to explain himself, saying the thing with Jasmine was complicated, and he made mistakes, but he still loved us. Then he asked Eve to convince me to be reasonable about Aunt's demands, saying the terms were too harsh and would destroy the family. Eve looked at me and asked what she should say back. I suggested she tell him that being reasonable means he needs to sign Aunt's agreement and stop making excuses for his behavior. Eve nodded and started typing exactly that, her fingers moving fast across the screen. She read it back to us, then hit send before she could second-guess herself. Aunt smiled and told Eve she was proud of her for setting a clear boundary with Dad instead of trying to smooth things over like we'd both been trained to do our whole lives. Aunt announced we were going to Target to buy Eve some clothes and basics since she only had what she wore to dinner last night. Walking through the store picking out toiletries and pajamas felt weirdly normal and nice, like we were just a regular aunt and nieces doing regular things on a Saturday morning. Eve kept thanking Aunt for every small item, a toothbrush, a pack of underwear, a cheap pair of pajamas, like she had to earn each thing or justify why she needed it. After the fifth thank you, Aunt stopped in the middle of the aisle and told Eve firmly that she didn't need to earn basic care, that she deserved it automatically just by existing. She said both of us had been trained to think we had to perform or achieve or be grateful for basic human necessities, but that was wrong, and she wasn't going to let us keep thinking that way. Eve started crying right there in the Target aisle, and Aunt pulled her into a hug while other shoppers walked around us. I grabbed a shopping cart and started loading it with the stuff Eve needed, plus some things I needed too, and it felt good to just pick things without calculating if I deserved them or not. We stopped for lunch at a quiet cafe near Aunt's house, sitting at a corner table away from other people. Aunt asked me what I wanted for my future now that I was 18. I just sat there for a minute because I realized no one had ever asked me that question seriously before. Every conversation at home was about what I should do to be more acceptable, how I should act to avoid making Mom angry, ways I could be less of a burden on the family. But no one ever asked what I actually wanted for myself, what kind of life I imagined having. I admitted I didn't know yet, but I'd like to figure it out without constantly defending my right to exist. Aunt nodded and said that was a perfect place to start, that figuring out who you are and what you want takes time and space, and she'd make sure I had both. She said there was no rush, that I could take my time exploring options and trying different things until something felt right. The idea that my future could be about discovering what I wanted instead of just surviving felt brand new, and I wasn't sure how to process it yet, but it felt like maybe things could actually be different now. Aunt leaned forward and asked what I thought about school, whether I'd finished high school or if I needed to complete my diploma. I told her I'd graduated 2 months ago, but hadn't thought about what came next because I was just focused on surviving at home. She nodded and started talking about community college programs in the area, how there were job training options too if I wanted to learn a trade instead of doing traditional college. She pulled out her phone and showed me websites for the local community college, scrolling through different programs while explaining that she'd support whatever path I chose as long as I was working towards something that mattered to me. The idea that I could actually pick something based on what I wanted instead of what would make me less of a burden felt completely new. I stared at the course listings on her phone and felt this weird mix of excitement and fear, like suddenly there were all these doors open but I didn't know which one to walk through. Aunt must have seen something in my face because she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me there was no rush to decide everything right now. She said I could take some time to think about it, maybe visit the campus, talk to some advisors, and figure out what felt right. Eve was watching us with this soft expression, and she said she wished someone had asked her what she actually wanted, instead of just assuming she'd follow the plan Mom and Dad laid out. Aunt looked at Eve and said it wasn't too late for her either, that once things settled down, she could explore her own interests too. We finished lunch and drove back to Aunt's house, and when we pulled into the driveway, there was already a car parked there. Aunt checked her phone and said Virginia Shaw was here right on time. Walking up to the front door, I felt my stomach tighten because this was about to get real, putting everything into legal terms and formal agreements. Virginia was waiting on the porch, a black woman probably in her 40s with neat braids and a professional but warm smile. She shook our hands and Aunt led us all inside to the dining room table. Virginia pulled out a legal pad and a laptop, arranging everything carefully while Aunt made tea. When we all sat down, Virginia looked directly at me and asked me to tell her about the history of mistreatment in my own words. Something about the way she asked, like she really wanted to hear and believe me, made it easier to start talking. I told her about the slurs, about being called darky since I was 12, about the food being withheld when I didn't meet their standards. I explained how they made me use skin bleaching creams and got angry when my skin didn't get lighter fast enough. I described watching Eve get new clothes and school supplies and birthday parties while I got hand-me-downs and leftovers in silence. Virginia took notes the whole time, occasionally asking specific questions like how often the food withholding happened or what exact words they used. Eve sat next to me and added details I'd forgotten, like the time Mom made me eat dinner in my room for a week, because I embarrassed her at a family gathering by being too dark next to my cousins. When I finished, Virginia set down her pen and looked at both of us with this expression that was part anger and part sadness. She said that everything we described was real abuse and it was serious and unacceptable. Then she explained that while the emotional abuse was damaging and wrong, the strongest leverage we had right now was the financial dependency and the written agreement Aunt was offering. She said she'd draft terms that were specific and measurable, things that couldn't be interpreted different ways or dismissed as trying. She wanted everything documented going forward too, dates and times and specific incidents, in case we ever needed legal protection for me or Eve. She explained that having a paper trail would make it much harder for my parents to claim they were making efforts if they actually weren't. Aunt nodded and said that was exactly what she wanted. Clear terms with clear consequences. Virginia started typing on her laptop, listing out potential terms while talking through each one. She said mandatory therapy was important, both family sessions and individual counseling for my parents to address their colorism and other issues. She wanted written apologies that acknowledged specific harms, not vague sorry statements. She said there needed to be zero tolerance for any colorist language or favoritism going forward, with immediate consequences if it happened. Eve suddenly spoke up and mentioned the skin bleaching creams, how Mom would get so angry when they didn't work fast enough and would accuse me of not using them properly. Virginia's whole face changed, her jaw tightening as she added something to her notes. She said there would be a specific term about no coerced appearance changes or comments about physical features, period. She looked at me and said that what was done to me was a form of abuse that people don't always recognize, trying to change a child's natural appearance because of colorist beliefs. Hearing a professional lawyer call it abuse and take it seriously made something shift in my chest. I'd spent so long thinking maybe I was too sensitive or making too big a deal out of it, but Virginia was treating my experiences as serious and unacceptable, rather than something I should just tolerate or get over. She kept typing and talking, building this framework of protection that felt solid and real. Aunt watched Virginia work with this satisfied expression, like she'd known Virginia would be exactly the right person for this. After about an hour, Virginia closed her laptop and said she'd have a draft agreement ready by tomorrow morning. She shook our hands again and told me and Eve directly that we deserved safety and respect, and this agreement was going to make sure we got it. After she left, Aunt sat us both down on the couch and brought us more tea. She had this gentle but serious look on her face as she said she thought we might both benefit from talking to a therapist, someone outside the family who could help us process everything. Eve said yes immediately, almost before Aunt finished the sentence. She admitted she'd been having panic attacks about the whole Jasmine situation, waking up at night with her heart racing and feeling like she couldn't breathe. I was more hesitant because therapy felt like admitting something was broken inside me, like I was the problem that needed fixing. Aunt must have seen my face because she reached over and explained that therapy wasn't about fixing me, it was about processing what was done to me. She said I'd been through years of abuse and manipulation, and having someone help me work through that didn't mean I was weak or damaged, it meant I was taking care of myself. The way she said it made sense, but I still felt weird about the idea. Aunt didn't push, just said she'd find some therapists for us to talk to, and we could decide after meeting them. That evening we were sitting in the living room watching TV when the doorbell rang. Aunt got up to answer it, and through the window I could see Mom standing there, mascara streaked down her face and her hair messy. Aunt opened the door but stepped outside and closed it behind her, not letting Mom into the house. Eve and I both moved to the window to watch, and I could see Mom gesturing frantically while Aunt stood completely still with her arms crossed. Mom was crying and talking fast, reaching out to touch Aunt's arm, but Aunt stepped back. The conversation went on for maybe 10 minutes, Mom getting more desperate and Aunt staying firm. Finally, Aunt turned and came back inside, locking the door behind her. She looked at us and said Mom wanted to apologize, but wasn't ready to sign anything yet because she thought the terms Virginia was drafting were too harsh. I felt this anger rise up in my chest, hot and sharp. Too harsh? After years of calling me slurs and withholding food and trying to bleach my skin, she thought being required to go to therapy and stop being racist was too harsh? I must have said some of that out loud because Aunt came over and sat next to me, putting her hand on my shoulder. She said my anger was completely valid and reasonable, that Mom had no right to negotiate after everything she'd done. Aunt's voice was calm but firm, as she explained that we weren't negotiating. The terms were the terms, and Mom had until tomorrow evening to decide. She said if we gave in now and let Mom bargain her way out of real consequences, it would just teach my parents they could still manipulate the situation. She looked right at me and said I deserved better than that pattern continuing, that I deserved people who would do the hard work of changing without needing to be convinced it was necessary. Eve's phone rang, and she looked at the screen, her face going pale. She showed me the caller ID, and it said Jasmine. Eve answered and immediately put it on speaker after asking Jasmine if that was okay. Jasmine's voice came through crying and scared, saying her mom was making her tell the whole truth about the affair to everyone. She said she never wanted any of this attention. She just wanted to disappear. Her voice was shaking as she explained that Dad had told her he was unhappy in his marriage and made her feel special and mature, like she was different from other girls her age. Now she felt stupid and used, and she couldn't stop crying. Eve's eyes were filling with tears too as she listened. Jasmine asked if Eve hated her, and Eve immediately said no, she could never hate her. Eve's voice was stronger than I expected as she told Jasmine she wasn't stupid. She was a victim of a grown man's manipulation. She said Dad was the adult who knew exactly what he was doing, and her mom Anita was right to demand accountability from him. Jasmine kept crying, but she sounded a little less panicked as Eve kept talking to her. They stayed on the phone for over an hour, Eve sitting on the floor with her back against the couch while Jasmine talked through everything. I sat there listening and watching Eve handle this with so much maturity, separating her anger at Dad from her care for her friend. She kept telling Jasmine that Dad's actions weren't Jasmine's fault, that he was the one who had power and responsibility in the situation. By the end of the call, Jasmine sounded calmer, and Eve promised to call her tomorrow. After she hung up, Eve just sat there staring at her phone, and I could see her processing everything. I told her she did really good, that she said all the right things. Eve looked up at me and said she was so angry at Dad for putting Jasmine in that position, for making her friend feel like any of this was her fault. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and found Aunt already at her laptop in the kitchen. She said Virginia had emailed the formal compliance agreement as a PDF early this morning. She printed it out and we sat at the table reading through it together. The document was several pages long with specific numbered terms. Mandatory weekly family therapy for 6 months with a licensed therapist who specialized in family trauma and colorism. Individual therapy for both mom and dad, also weekly for 6 months minimum. Written apology letters that had to acknowledge specific harms by name, not general sorry statements. Zero tolerance for any colorist language or comments about physical appearance, with immediate termination of financial support if violated. Both daughters get to choose their living arrangements freely without pressure or guilt trips from parents. Parents had to attend a workshop on colorism and internalized racism within the first month. There were more terms, too, about financial transparency and respectful communication and respecting boundaries. Each term had clear language about what would happen if it was broken, and most of them led to immediate loss of financial support. Reading it felt surreal, seeing all the protection and accountability spelled out in official language. Aunt asked what we thought, and Eve said it looked perfect. Everything we needed. I agreed, though part of me still couldn't believe this was actually happening, that someone was finally making my parents face real consequences for how they treated me. I scrolled down to the next section and saw more terms about financial stuff. My parents had to go to 2 meetings with a money counselor to learn about their real money situation and make a budget for when Aunt stopped paying for everything. I looked up at Aunt and realized she wasn't planning to support them forever, just long enough to make sure Eve and I were safe, and they actually changed. The phone rang and Aunt checked the screen, then put it on speaker. Dad's voice came through shaky and desperate, asking if they could meet in person to talk about the terms. Aunt said they could meet, but only at Virginia's office with the lawyer there, and he had 4 hours to decide or the offer went away completely. I could hear how scared he sounded through the phone, almost begging, and part of me felt sad that our family came to this. But a bigger part felt relieved that someone finally had enough power to make them face what they did. Aunt hung up and looked at both of us, asking if we were okay with how this was going. Eve nodded first, and I did too, feeling like this was the only way anything would actually change. We spent the rest of the morning trying to distract ourselves with TV, but nobody could really focus. At exactly 2 p.m., Aunt's phone buzzed with a text from Virginia. Both parents had come to her office and signed the agreement. Aunt let out this long breath like she'd been holding it for hours and showed me and Eve the message on her screen. We all just sat there for a minute not saying anything, processing that it actually worked. Eve asked what would happen if they broke any of the rules, and Aunt explained they'd lose everything, and we'd already have legal papers showing the pattern, which would protect us if we ever needed restraining orders or anything else. That made it feel more real, knowing there were actual protections in place now. That evening, my laptop dinged with new emails. The apology letters had arrived. I opened Dad's first, and it was pretty short, maybe 3 paragraphs talking about how stressed he'd been and how he made mistakes. Mom's was longer, but mostly about her own feelings, explaining how her mother treated her growing up and how hard everything had been for her. I read through both of them twice, and neither one really said sorry for the specific things they did to me. They were making excuses and talking about themselves instead of taking real responsibility. I showed them to Aunt and told her these weren't good enough. She read them carefully, nodding, then opened her laptop. Aunt pulled up her email and started typing a response to send through Virginia. She wrote that the apologies needed to be completely redone with specific details about what they did wrong and how it hurt me, not explanations or excuses for why they did it. She gave them 48 hours to send new versions, and said this was part of the therapy work they needed to do. Watching her send that email made me feel powerful in a way I never had before, like my opinion about whether their apologies were real actually mattered. Aunt wasn't going to let them get away with half trying. The next 2 days fell into a routine that felt surprisingly normal. Eve and I helped Aunt with cooking dinner and cleaning up after meals. Aunt taught us stuff our parents never bothered with, like how to read bank statements and make a budget for monthly expenses. She treated us like we were capable people learning important skills, not like we were burdens she was stuck with. The difference in how she talked to us compared to how Mom did was so obvious it almost hurt. In the mornings, we'd make breakfast together and plan out the day, and in the evenings, we'd watch movies or play card games. It felt like what I always imagined a real family was supposed to be like. On the second morning, I opened my laptop and started looking at job websites. I filtered by part-time and entry-level and found a local bookstore that was hiring. The listing said they needed someone for 15 to 20 hours a week. No experience required. Just had to be reliable and like books. I showed it to Aunt and she got excited, immediately pulling up a blank document to help me write a resume. I'd never made one before and didn't even know where to start. She walked me through listing my high school info and the volunteer work I'd done, making it look way more professional than I thought possible. Then she practiced interview questions with me, asking what my strengths were and why I wanted the job. When I said I probably wasn't qualified enough, she stopped me and said firmly that I was 18 and willing to learn, which was exactly what entry-level jobs needed. That made me feel brave enough to actually apply. 3 days after Aunt sent her email demanding better apologies, my inbox showed 2 new messages. I opened them with my heart beating fast. Mom's revised letter was completely different this time. She specifically named calling me Darky, withholding food from me as punishment, pressuring me to use skin bleaching cream and treating Eve better because of her lighter skin. Dad's new letter talked about his affair with Eve's friend Jasmine, lying about having a job and not protecting me from Mom's racist treatment. Reading the actual words for what they did wrong made me start crying. Not sad crying, but this weird relief crying. It was the first time in my whole life they'd actually admitted the specific things they did, instead of just saying they were sorry in a vague way. Aunt came in and saw me crying, immediately asking if I was okay. I showed her the letters, and she read them carefully, then asked if I wanted to respond, or just let them know I got them. I thought about it for a while, and decided to write back something short. I typed that I received the letters and appreciated them naming the specific things they did. But rebuilding trust would take a long time and consistent changed behavior, not just words. Eve wrote something similar when I showed her what I'd written. We sent them at the same time, making sure we presented a united front so they knew we were both serious about this. The bookstore called 2 days later and asked if I could come in for an interview that afternoon. I got there 15 minutes early and met the manager, a woman named Patience Ross, who had kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun. She asked about my interests and what books I liked to read. When I started talking about loving to read and how I'd spent so much time in my school library, her whole face lit up like she was genuinely excited. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about books and customer service and what the job would involve. At the end, she offered me 20 hours a week to start, weekday afternoons and Saturday mornings. I said yes immediately, trying not to sound too desperate, even though I was thrilled. Walking out to catch the bus back to Aunt's house, I felt proud that I'd gotten this job on my own merit, not because someone felt sorry for me or because I had connections. The next day, Aunt asked if I wanted her to come to the first therapy session for support. I thought about it while washing dishes after breakfast, and realized having her there might make Mom and Dad focus on blaming her instead of looking at their own actions. I told Aunt I wanted to go with just Eve because this needed to be about what they did to us, not about Aunt's money or decisions. Aunt nodded and said that made sense, then handed me a card with the therapist's information written on it. The woman's name was Mariana Hudson, and she worked with families dealing with trauma and colorism specifically. I called from Aunt's kitchen and scheduled for Thursday afternoon. When I hung up, my hands were shaking a little, but I also felt ready to finally say everything out loud in front of them. Thursday came fast, and Eve and I rode the bus to Mariana's office together without talking much. The waiting room had soft chairs and paintings of landscapes on the walls. When Mariana came out to get us, I felt safer immediately just looking at her. She was a black woman, probably in her 50s, with gray starting in her hair and kind eyes that looked like they'd heard hard stories before. She shook both our hands and led us back to her office, where Mom and Dad were already sitting on a couch looking uncomfortable. Mariana sat in a chair facing all of us and pulled out a notebook. She started by setting ground rules in a calm voice that somehow made it clear she was completely in charge. No interrupting each other, no name-calling or insults. Everyone speaks from their own experience using I statements instead of accusing. She looked at each of us while she said this, and we all nodded. Mom immediately started talking about her own childhood and how her mother treated her. Mariana held up one hand gently and said, "Today was about listening to me and Eve first, and Mom would have time in her individual therapy to process her own experiences." Mom's mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but she closed it and sat back. Mariana turned to me and asked if I wanted to share what brought us here. I took a breath and started talking about being called Darky since I was 12 years old, about watching Eve get new clothes while I wore hand-me-downs that didn't fit, about the nights they forgot to set my place at dinner and I went to bed hungry, about Mom buying skin bleaching cream and getting angry when it didn't work fast enough. My voice stayed steady even though my chest felt tight. When I mentioned the food withholding, I saw Mom's face start to crumple and her eyes got wet. Part of me felt satisfied seeing her finally understand what she did. Another part felt weird and guilty for causing her pain even though I was just telling the truth. Eve spoke up next without Mariana even asking. Her voice was shaking, but she kept going. She talked about the guilt she'd carried for years being the favored one. She said getting more stuff and better treatment didn't make her happy. It made her feel responsible for my suffering. She was scared that if she defended me or shared her things, they'd turn on her too and she'd lose everything. She looked at Mom while she talked and said she loved her, but the favoritism damaged our relationship even though we stayed close. She said she spent years feeling like she had to earn their love by being perfect and light-skinned enough. Mom started to say something about not meaning to make Eve feel that way. Mariana stopped her immediately and said this session was for listening, and Mom would have plenty of time to respond in her own individual therapy. Mom pressed her lips together and looked down at her hands. Dad cleared his throat and tried to apologize again for the affair and all his lies about having a job. Mariana turned to him and said very clearly that today's session was about the colorism and how they treated me specifically. The affair was a separate issue he needed to address in his own therapy, and separately with Anita and Jasmine. She said we weren't going to let everything blend into general family chaos. We were staying focused. I felt grateful that Mariana was keeping things clear, because it would be easy for Dad to make everything about his mistakes, and avoid talking about how he let Mom treat me badly for years without saying anything. Dad nodded and sat back looking uncomfortable. The rest of the session, Mariana asked me and Eve questions about specific incidents and how they made us feel. She took notes and asked Mom and Dad if they remembered these events. They both said yes quietly. When the session ended and we walked out to the parking lot, Mom followed me and Eve. She asked if we could hug. I stopped walking and looked at her. I wasn't ready for that, and I told her honestly that I needed to see consistent change over time before physical affection felt safe. The words came out clearer than I expected. Mom's face looked hurt and her eyes got wet again, but she nodded and took a step back. She said she understood. I felt guilty seeing her look so sad, but I also felt proud of myself for saying what I actually needed, instead of just going along to make her feel better. Eve squeezed my hand as we walked to the bus stop. Back at Aunt's house, I sat on the couch feeling drained. Aunt made tea and sat across from me asking how it went. I admitted it was harder than I expected to watch Mom cry. Aunt said it was okay to have complicated feelings, that I could see Mom was in pain while still protecting myself. She reminded me that Mom's tears didn't erase years of calling me slurs and withholding food. Real change shows up in actions over months, not emotions in one therapy session. Hearing Aunt say that made me feel less guilty. Eve came downstairs after changing clothes and said she felt lighter after finally saying out loud that the favoritism hurt her too. My first shift at the bookstore was Saturday morning. I got there 15 minutes early and Patience showed me how to use the register and the computer system for looking up books. The store smelled like paper and coffee from the cafe in the corner. Patience was patient with me while I learned, making jokes when I messed up entering a return. She showed me how to help customers find specific titles and how to recommend books based on what they liked. By the end of my 4-hour shift, I felt tired but good. A customer told Patience I was helpful, and Patience smiled at me. Having my own money from my own work felt like a huge step toward actually being independent and not needing my parents for anything. Eve started online therapy sessions with a counselor who worked with teenagers dealing with family trauma. After her first session on Tuesday, she came downstairs looking different, lighter somehow. She told me it helped to talk to someone who had zero connection to our family situation. She said her counselor was helping her process the guilt about being the favored child and understand that she wasn't responsible for Mom and Dad's choices. She seemed relieved to have her own space to work through everything without worrying about how it affected anyone else. 2 weeks into living with Aunt, I got my first paycheck from the bookstore. Aunt helped me open my own bank account at the credit union near her house. Seeing my name on the account and depositing money I actually earned myself felt incredibly powerful. Aunt suggested I save most of it for future goals, but also spend a little on something just for me. I bought a journal with a purple cover from the bookstore using my employee discount. That night, I started writing down everything I was processing and feeling. Getting it out of my head and onto paper helped me think more clearly. Mom texted asking if she could take me and Eve to lunch to show she was trying. I showed the text to Aunt, who said it was completely my choice but suggested keeping it short and in a public place. Eve and I talked about it and agreed to meet Mom at a casual restaurant for 1 hour with clear start and end times. That way we controlled the situation instead of Mom controlling it. I texted back saying we'd meet her Saturday at noon at the diner near Aunt's house and we'd need to leave by 1. Mom texted back 3 heart emojis and said she understood. Saturday came and Eve and I got to the diner 15 minutes early to pick a booth near the back exit. Mom arrived exactly at noon wearing jeans and a plain sweater instead of her usual designer clothes. She slid into the booth across from us and picked up her menu but kept looking at me over the top of it. The waitress came and took our orders and Mom asked me how the bookstore job was going. I told her about learning the register system and helping customers find books, and she nodded along without interrupting. She asked what kinds of books people bought most, and I explained the mix of bestsellers and local interest titles. When I mentioned my employee discount, she smiled a little and said that sounded like a good benefit. Eve talked about her online classes and Mom asked questions about her schedule and assignments. The whole time, Mom kept her hands folded on the table and never once mentioned my skin or my hair or compared me to Eve. The food came and we ate mostly in silence, but it was different from the old silences at home. This one felt careful instead of hostile. Mom asked Eve about her therapy, and Eve said it was helping her work through things. Mom's face tightened, but she just said she was glad Eve had that support. When the hour hit, I checked my phone and said we needed to go. Mom pulled out her wallet to pay, but I told her we'd split it 3 ways. She looked surprised, but agreed, and we each put cash on the table. In the parking lot, Mom started to reach for a hug, but stopped herself and just said thank you for meeting her. Eve and I walked to my car, and neither of us spoke until we were back on the road. 2 days later, Aunt came into my room holding her phone. She said Anita had called asking if I would talk to Jasmine because the girl was struggling hard with shame and wouldn't leave her house. Aunt explained that Anita thought hearing from Eve's sister that I didn't blame Jasmine might help her feel less alone. My stomach twisted because I barely knew Jasmine beyond seeing her at the house for sleepovers with Eve. But I remembered being 18 and terrified when my parents kicked me out, and how much it meant when Aunt believed me. I told Aunt I'd do a short phone call if Anita thought it would help. That evening, Anita texted me Jasmine's number, and I sat on my bed staring at it for 10 minutes before calling. Jasmine answered on the 4th ring with a quiet hello. I said it was Eve's sister and asked if she was okay to talk. She started crying immediately and saying she was so sorry and so stupid for believing Dad's lies. The words poured out about how Dad made her feel special and mature and said his marriage was basically over anyway. She kept calling herself an idiot and saying she should have known better. I cut in and told her firmly she wasn't stupid or an idiot. I said she was young and got manipulated by a grown man who had power over her through his connection to our family. My voice got stronger as I explained that I knew what it was like when adults who should protect you end up hurting you instead. I told her that what Dad did was his choice and his responsibility, not hers. She cried harder, but it sounded different, like relief instead of shame. She said nobody else had said it wasn't her fault, and she'd been carrying all this guilt about breaking up a family. I told her our family was already broken long before she came into the picture, and Dad's affair just exposed what was already there. We talked for 40 minutes, and by the end she sounded steadier. She thanked me 3 times before hanging up, and I sat there feeling drained, but also like maybe sharing my own pain could actually help someone else. The second family therapy session happened on Thursday evening. Mariana had us all sit in the same seats as last time, and started by asking Mom and Dad what they'd learned from their individual therapy sessions. Mom talked about recognizing her own internalized colorism, and Dad mentioned starting to understand his avoidance patterns. Then Mariana shifted focus directly to colorism and its impact on our family. She pulled out worksheets and assigned homework. Mom had to research colorism in our community and write about how it affected her growing up, and then how she perpetuated it with me. Dad had to write about how he enabled Mom's colorism by staying silent and never defending me. Mariana said the papers were due before the next session in 2 weeks. I felt skeptical they'd actually do the work instead of just writing something surface level to check the box. When I said that out loud, Mariana nodded and explained that accountability requires action, not just feeling bad or saying sorry. She said the homework would show whether they were serious about change or just going through motions to keep Aunt's financial support. Eve suddenly spoke up in a voice that was quiet but clear. She said she'd been thinking a lot about where she wanted to live and she'd decided to stay with Aunt through the rest of high school, even if Mom and Dad followed through on all the terms. Mom's face went pale and then red and her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dad leaned forward and asked if Eve would at least visit them sometimes. Eve said maybe eventually, but right now she needed space to figure out who she was outside of being the favorite child. She said living at Aunt's was the first time she'd felt like she could just be herself, without worrying about maintaining some perfect image. Mom started crying silently, and Dad put his hand on her arm. Mariana asked Mom what she was feeling, and Mom whispered that she understood, but it hurt to lose both her daughters. Mariana gently corrected her that she hadn't lost us. She'd pushed us away through her choices, and now she had to accept the consequences while doing the work to maybe rebuild trust over time. Back at Aunt's house, I opened my laptop and started searching community college programs. I found one about 20 minutes away with a social work track that looked interesting. The description talked about helping families navigate trauma and crisis situations, and connecting people with resources. I read through the course list and felt something click into place. Aunt came in with tea and sat next to me looking at the screen. Her face lit up when she saw what I was researching. She pulled the laptop closer and started showing me how to understand the financial aid pages and application deadlines. We spent 2 hours going through requirements and filling out the initial application. Aunt explained FAFSA and grants, and how to calculate what I'd need to cover after aid. The idea of studying to help other people going through family trauma felt meaningful in a way nothing else had. Like maybe all the pain I'd survived could actually have purpose beyond just getting through it. Aunt printed out the application checklist and stuck it on the fridge with a magnet. She said we'd work on it together step by step and make sure I had everything submitted before the deadline. 3 weeks into the agreement, Aunt got a call from Mom. I was in the kitchen making lunch when Aunt answered and put it on speaker. Mom's voice sounded shaky and raw. She said she and Dad had just finished their colorism workshop, and she felt completely shaken. She described learning about how colorism gets passed down through generations, and how the things her own mother said to her got planted deep in her mind and came out targeting me. Mom said she'd spent the whole drive home crying because she finally understood the full damage she'd caused. Aunt asked if Mom was making excuses or taking responsibility, and Mom said quickly that it wasn't an excuse, just the first time she'd connected her own pain to her harmful actions toward me. She said the workshop leaders had them do an exercise where they imagined their children hearing every colorist thing they'd ever said, and she'd nearly thrown up. Aunt's expression was hard to read, but she told Mom that awareness was a start, but changing behavior was what mattered. After the call ended, Aunt looked at me and asked how I felt hearing that. I said I didn't know yet, that it sounded like real realization, but I needed to see if it translated into actual different treatment over time. Dad's individual therapy sessions revealed things nobody expected. His therapist called Aunt to discuss adding psychiatric evaluation to his treatment plan. Aunt put it on speaker with permission, and the therapist explained Dad had been struggling with depression and feelings of inadequacy for years. The lying about his job and the affair were symptoms of deeper mental health issues he'd never addressed. None of this excused his choices, but it explained some of the patterns of avoidance and deception. The therapist recommended evaluation for medication, and Dad had actually already scheduled the appointment. I felt strange sitting there listening to this because part of me wanted to feel empathy for his mental health struggles, but another part was still angry about all his choices and lies. Aunt said both things could be true at once, that Dad could be dealing with real mental illness and still be responsible for the harm he caused. The depression didn't make the affair okay, or erase the years he stayed silent while Mom abused me. Anita and Dad worked through attorneys to handle the paternity and support situation. Aunt showed me the emails going back and forth with legal language about testing and agreements. The paternity test came back confirming Dad was the father. Dad agreed to child support payments and supervised visitation once the baby was born. Jasmine had decided to keep the baby with Anita's support. The legal agreement laid out specific terms about Dad's contact and financial responsibility. Reading through it felt surreal because this was my dad having a baby with my sister's teenage best friend, and it was all getting handled through lawyers like a business transaction. But at least there was a clear plan that protected Jasmine instead of leaving everything messy and uncertain. Anita had made sure Jasmine's needs came first in every part of the agreement. My first month at the bookstore ended and Patience called me into her office. My heart started racing thinking I'd messed something up, but she smiled and gestured for me to sit. She pulled up her notes and said I'd gotten consistently positive feedback from customers about being helpful and friendly. She mentioned my attendance was perfect, and I picked up new tasks quickly. Then she said there might be opportunities for more hours, or even a shift supervisor position eventually if I was interested. I felt my face get hot, and I thanked her probably too many times. Having a boss who saw my potential instead of my flaws felt revolutionary. Walking home that day, I thought about how a month ago I was standing on the sidewalk with garbage bags, and now I had a job where someone valued my work and saw a future for me there. The fourth therapy session came a few weeks later, and Mariana started by asking how everyone was doing with the work between sessions. Mom said she'd been reading about colorism and realizing how deep it went in her own family growing up. Dad mentioned his depression medication was helping him think more clearly. Mariana nodded and then shifted to talking about trust, explaining that it gets built back slowly through consistent actions over time, not through apologies or promises. She looked at Mom and Dad directly and said they needed to accept that I might never feel completely safe with them again, that some damage leaves permanent marks even when healing happens. Mom started crying, but she said she understood, and that she'd rather have limited contact with me than none at all. I felt something loosen in my chest, hearing Mariana set realistic expectations, instead of pushing for some fake happy reunion. After the session ended, Mom asked if she could hug me, and I said not yet, and she nodded and stepped back without arguing. Eve and I spent the next week planning something we'd been talking about for a while. We wanted to take Aunt to dinner using money we'd earned ourselves, my paycheck from the bookstore, and Eve's babysitting money combined. When we told Aunt our plan, she got teary and said we didn't owe her anything. We insisted because it felt important to actively show gratitude instead of just saying thank you. We picked a nice Italian place and made a reservation for Friday night. At dinner, Aunt kept trying to pay, and we physically blocked her from getting the check. The evening was relaxed and full of laughter, with Eve telling funny stories about the kids she babysat, and me describing weird customer requests at the bookstore. Sitting there with both of them, I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like, easy and warm without constantly watching what I said or how I looked. The next week, Aunt helped me finish my community college application. The personal essay question asked about overcoming challenges, and I wrote about growing up with colorism in my own family and wanting to study social work to help other families heal from similar wounds. Writing it made me cry, but in a good way, like I was turning all that pain into something with purpose. Aunt read it and said it was powerful and honest, that admissions officers would see my strength. I submitted everything online and then spent 3 weeks obsessively checking my email. When the acceptance letter finally came with news of a partial scholarship, I screamed so loud that Eve came running thinking something was wrong. I showed her the screen and we jumped around Aunt's kitchen like little kids. These were the first happy tears I'd cried in months, maybe years. 6 months after that family dinner where everything exploded, Mom and Dad completed their mandatory therapy. Mariana sent Aunt an email saying they'd done genuine work on their issues, showing up consistently and engaging honestly with the material. She suggested we could try monthly family dinners as a low-pressure way to maintain connection while respecting the boundaries we'd set. I agreed to try it with the clear understanding that I could stop any time if it became harmful to my mental health. The first monthly dinner happened at a neutral restaurant, not anyone's house. Mom and Dad arrived early and were already seated when Eve and I walked in. Mom complimented my work ethic without comparing me to anyone or adding conditions. Dad asked about my college plans and actually listened to my answers instead of interrupting with advice. Eve and I exchanged glances across the table that said we were both cautiously hopeful, but still guarded. When the evening ended, I didn't feel drained or anxious like I used to after seeing them. That felt like real progress, the kind you can measure in how your body feels instead of just what people say. Looking back now, 6 months after being kicked out with garbage bags, I'm doing better than I ever imagined possible. I'm taking classes at community college in social work, still working at the bookstore where Patience just promoted me to shift supervisor, living safely with Aunt, and building a genuine relationship with Eve based on honesty instead of survival. My parents are doing their therapy work and respecting boundaries, which doesn't erase the years of harm, but creates possibility for something different going forward. The trauma will always be part of my story, but it's not the whole story anymore. Eve graduated high school with honors last month and decided to attend college nearby so she could keep living with Aunt. At her graduation ceremony, Mom and Dad sat in a different section from us, but they waved and smiled, respecting the space we needed. After the ceremony, we took photos together as a family, and the smiles were genuine, even if they were still a bit careful. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, which mattered more. Now I'm sitting on Aunt's porch with Eve, both of us with iced tea and homework spread across the table between us. The evening air is warm and I can hear kids playing basketball down the street. Eve is highlighting something in her textbook, and I'm reviewing notes for my exam next week. I stop for a moment and realize I'm genuinely happy. Not pretending or hoping, just actually content with where I am and who I'm with. The trauma of being called slurs and kicked out will always be part of my story, but it's not the whole story anymore. I have safety, education, meaningful work, and a family that's being rebuilt on truth and respect, instead of lies and favoritism. My future feels wide open in a way it never did before. For the first time in my life, my dark skin feels like just one beautiful part of who I am, not something I need to apologize for or hide or fix. We're all healing at our own pace, taking it one day at a time, and that's exactly how it should be.